Friends, this morning we're continuing our sermon series called Journey to Generosity. This is our stewardship series, and so we are talking about the ways in which the gifts that we are called to give, whether these are gifts of our time, our talent, or our financial resources, are an opportunity for us to give back to God who has given so graciously to us. This past week, you should have received a letter from me as well as commitment cards. These commitment cards are what we will use to estimate our giving for the 2020 calendar year. If you did not receive a letter from me, that means one of two things. Either you're not in our database yet, or your address is incorrect in our database. So we would like to correct that, and we would invite you to do that by calling the office and letting them know letting Robina know that we need to update your records with us. And I also have in the back a few extra copies of the letter, not personalized, I'm afraid, because I don't know who they're going to. But there is a copy of the letter that I sent out as well as the commitment cards, and you're invited to take one of the financial commitment cards per family and one of the spiritual gifts commitment cards, for each adult or teen person in your family. Now, I know that we have a lot of new folks with us this morning, and I want you to know that we are not expecting you to make a commitment to this church. We know that is too soon. And so, but I do believe that what I'm about to share in my message will also apply to you in terms of your walk with Christ and your ability to give of yourself in ministry to the world. So I'm reading from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 2 through 10, and I'm using the paraphrase called The Message, which is not a translation, but rather is an interpretation of this particular passage. These are the things I want you to teach and preach. If you have leaders there who teach otherwise, who refuse the solid words of our Master Jesus and this godly instruction, tag them for what they are: ignorant windbags who infect the air with germs of envy, controversy, bad-mouthing, suspicious rumors. Eventually, there's an epidemic of backstabbing, and truth is but a distant memory. They think religion is a way to make a fast buck. A devout life does bring wealth, but it's the rich simplicity of being yourself before God. Since we entered the world penniless and will leave it penniless, if we have bread on the table and shoes on our feet, that is enough. But if it's only money these leaders are after, they'll self-destruct in no time. Lust for money brings trouble, and nothing but trouble. Going down that path, some lose their footing in the faith completely and live to regret it bitterly ever after. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. An elderly man was desperately ill and very close to his death. He was so concerned about what would happen in the afterlife that he wanted to be prepared. So he called his closest friends, his doctor, his pastor, and his business manager. And he summoned them all to his bedside. When they arrived, the old man said to them, "I know they say you can't take it with you, but what if they're wrong? How do we know for sure? So I've asked you all here because you are my closest friends. I want you to help me be prepared when I die. So I'm giving each of you an envelope containing $100,000 in cash. And I want you to promise me that at the end of my funeral, you will put the envelopes in my jacket pocket. That way, if I need money in the afterlife, I'll be ready. Promise you'll do this for me." Well, his friends promised that they would. Well, not long after that, the man did pass away. And after the funeral, each of his friends were seen slipping something into the man's jacket pocket. And as they approached his casket and paid their final respects, they could see that there were envelopes in his pocket. Well, after the service, while these three friends were visiting with each other, the doctor said very sheepishly, "Guys, I have a confession to make. I'm afraid I've done a really bad thing. I know our friend trusted us to give him back this money, but the hospital where I practice is desperately in need of a new CAT scan. So I took $20,000, which isn't going to buy much, right, out of the envelope before putting the rest in his pocket. I am so sorry I broke my promise." Well, at that point, the minister cleared his throat and hung his head. "I too have a confession," he said quietly. "As you know, our church is overburdened by the needs of the poor and the homeless. I just couldn't see burying all that money. So I took $50,000 in order to help the homeless. Then I put the rest of his money in our friend's pocket. I am so sorry. I did not keep my promise." Upon hearing these confessions, the business manager exclaimed, "I can't believe what I'm hearing. I'm deeply disappointed that you would break a solemn trust. He was our friend, and we all made a promise." "So you gave him back the full amount?" the doctor and the minister asked. "Well, of course I did," the business manager said, quite proudly. "I gave him my personal check for $100,000. You know, we often hear people say that you can't take it with you, although that doesn't keep some people from trying. In fact, some would say that our American attitude toward wealth is not only unhealthy, but it demonstrates a lack of concern and compassion for the needs of others. Some say that that's a function of American individualism, where the needs of the one is more important than the needs of the many. But others say it's simply a function of greed. Regardless, the American attitude about money and our attitude toward our stuff can be detrimental to our well-being as individuals and as a society. In an article called "Cultural Attitudes Toward Money," author Philippa Viola writes about different cultural attitudes toward money. She writes that in many Asian cultures, for example, money is a necessity for survival, not as an indicator of one's social status or as a requirement for overall happiness. Generally speaking, in Asian cultures, they value life balance far more than the collection of wealth. Their goal then is to make just enough money to survive and enjoy collective, family, and societal goals. Likewise, in many European cultures, money is used to enrich one's social life. In Europe, it is better to work to live rather than live to work. And in the African culture, money exists to benefit the entire community instead of the individual. The more money an individual makes in many African cultures, the more they can share with each other. And in some Middle Eastern cultures, particularly those where the Muslim faith is predominant, the third pillar of Islam, called zakat, obligates them to donate their earnings over a certain amount in order to care for the needs of the poor. Keeping it for themselves is simply not an option. Giving it away is required. So how then are we as Christians and Americans supposed to feel about wealth? Well, if we look to our New Testament scriptures, we will find plenty of passages meant to guide us in our relationship with money. Like the story of Jesus and the rich young ruler, where Jesus tells him to sell everything he has, give the proceeds to the poor, and then become a follower of Jesus. We all know what happened there, right? It didn't end well for the rich young ruler. Instead, he simply walked away. Or when Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Or when Jesus said just moments before that, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. Instead, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Yes, Jesus said a lot about our relationship with money and what that should look like. But what he said in response to the question about taxes, now that was pure genius. You see, he knew that the religious authorities were trying to trick him. If he said, "Yes, you must pay taxes to the Roman government," those who were passionate about the resistance against Rome would become angry and hostile toward Jesus. And if he said, "No, don't pay your taxes," he could be arrested. In fact, he probably would have been arrested and tried for treason against Rome. Jesus was caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. So instead, he says what no one expects him to say. He asks for the coin and he says, "Whose image is on it?" And then he says, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." His implication is clear. We who are created in the image of God are meant to belong to God. Jesus isn't saying that we as believers shouldn't pay our taxes, but he is, however, saying that we shouldn't pay more than our fair share, because the rest belongs to God. Now, when you think about it, Jesus' response to that question makes perfect sense, because it is important for us to pay our taxes to the government, and it is important for us to support God's ministries. Because when we do, we make an investment in our world, both secular and sacred. We invest in the world in which we live, and we are investing in the realm of God. Now, I'm going to venture a guess here, but I'm thinking that probably on April 15th, most of you are not all that excited about paying taxes to the government. Am I right? But when you think about it, there are good reasons why we need to pay our fair share. For example, our public schools are primarily funded through tax revenue. And if we want our children to have good schools, then we need to pay our taxes to the state. Now, and some of you might be thinking, "But I don't have kids in school." And while that's true, even though your tax dollars aren't directly benefiting you, they do benefit the children who live in your community. And if we expect those children to grow up and be productive adults in our society, then we all must contribute to their education. What was it that they said about it takes a village to raise a child? In addition, our military is funded by our tax dollars that we pay. And in troubling times such as these, who doesn't want a strong military? But let's look a little closer to home. I'm going to venture a guess that if you turn on the faucet in your house, you expect water to come out, right? Right. And if you flip the light switch, you expect the lights to come on, right? Right. So, and in most cases, the infrastructure that brings water to our faucets and electricity to our homes is funded by our tax dollars at work. And if we want good roads on which to drive our cars, or police officers and firefighters who respond at a moment's notice, then we have to pay our taxes. It's a given. But we also know that the same is true in doing the work of the church, by giving our gifts to the church. Now, as a congregation, we want a nice place where we can worship God, right? And meeting spaces where we can fellowship with one another. We expect our worship spaces to be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. We even expect coffee and snacks because we're Methodists. That's just the way we roll. And you all expect to have a pastor who prepares and leads worship and provides spiritual care. You all also expect to have musicians who share their talents by making a joyful noise to the Lord. We all expect Sunday school teachers and children and youth leaders who will provide religious education for children, teens, as well as adults. And when we're sick or grieving, or if we need advice or someone to talk to, we expect the church to be there for us. And all of these things require resources. They require our time, our talents, and yes, our money. All of those things that are shared with God and the church. So the taxes we pay to the government and the gifts we give to the church are all investments in our world. Investments that we hope will make life a little better, not just for us, but for everyone. And from that perspective, our taxes and gifts are very much alike. But that is where the similarity ends, my friends. Because when it comes to paying taxes and giving gifts to the church, the way we determine how much we pay or how much we give is very, very different. With regard to paying taxes, most of the time we pay whether we want to or not. Because often the tax is already built in to the product, right? Or when we buy something and we get to the cash register, then the sales tax is added in. And in the case of income tax, we pay that whether we want to or not because, quite frankly, we just don't want to go to jail, right? So paying taxes, for the most part, isn't optional. It is a requirement of our lives. But here in this church, and in many churches, when it comes to the gifts we give to the church, whether those gifts are gifts of our time, our talent, or our financial resources, we get to choose whether we will give or not. We also get to choose how much we will give. Now, every year when we get to the end of Form 1040, Uncle Sam tells us how much tax we need to pay. But when we get to the end of the worship service every week, the church doesn't tell you how much to give. That decision is left up to each of us. Now, God does give us a guideline. It's called a tithe, which in Hebrew means tenth, 1/10. So we are urged to give a tenth. But a tenth of what? Do we give a tenth of our gross income? Or all of our assets, or our net income? And if it's a tenth of our time, is it a 24-hour day, or an 8-hour work day, or whatever happens to be left over once we get to the end of the day? Quite frankly, it's up to us to decide, and how we decide is a reflection of our values. It's a reflection of the priorities we place on the work of God. Now, I know that there are many ways that we can spend our time, our talent, and our financial resources. I also know that there are many entities, including the church, that make demands on us every single day. But in the end, we get to decide. We get to choose how we will use our resources. And what we choose to spend them on says a lot about the values that we hold dear. If we value the things of this world, like the accumulation of wealth, or we prioritize our own needs over the needs of others, we will spend our time, talent, and money on the things of this world, treasures on earth. But if we are motivated by the values of God, unconditional love, compassion, and caring for others, we will spend our time, talent, and money on the things that are of God, treasure in heaven? Will the things of this world take precedence over the things God wants us to do? Or will God's priorities prevail through your giving? The choice ultimately is yours. But there is one thing that is sure: you can't take it with you. Amen.